I recently went and saw the new Superman movie, and no, this is not going to be a review like everyone else is doing right now, but I will give a very quick take on it. The movie was enjoyable, and all the fears about it being too political were overblown. Either that, or James Gunn just does not have a clue about actual domestic or foreign issues. And judging by his pre-release comments, I kind of tend to believe the latter, that he knows nothing about politics. But that's not what I want to focus on. But I am going to focus on a single idea that motivates Superman throughout the movie. Nobody should die.
I wasn't representing anybody except for me and doing good.
I would question myself in the same situation and consider the consequences.
People were going to die.
At face value, that philosophy sounds great. Prevent people from dying. Perfect, simple, classic superhero stuff. But that scene made me think about real-world foreign policy. Does the mindset of no one should die actually work in reality? The answer is no, obviously, it does not. But somehow, this simplistic idea seems to have taken hold among much of the online right these days. So let's look at how this plays out in the foreign policy views of Dave Smith and Tucker Carlson. So both Tucker and Dave's recent foreign policy can be summed up by Superman's line, "People were going to die." Their philosophy is that if American action risks people dying, we should not act. Or, I guess, to be more accurate to them, if people will die by American weaponry, then the action is bad. But if we just sit back and let people die at the hands of others, that's somehow perfectly acceptable. You saw this mindset at play after Trump's recent decision to send more weapons to Ukraine. According to Dave Smith, this means Zelensky is now the new boss of Trump. And this is weeks after Netanyahu was apparently the new boss of Trump. In Dave's world, sending military aid to another country means that this country now owns you. That's not just wrong, that's just an idiotic take. Well, we're going to go and look at Dave's appearance on Lex Fridman's show a few months ago. When asked if military intervention is ever justified, he starts out by saying yes, sometimes it is. So let's take a look at the clip.
I think we got to this discussion from the military-industrial complex and military intervention and Ron Paul before that. If you can, rewind a little bit, is there any amount, according to you and according to various flavors of libertarianism, is there any amount of military intervention that's justified, that's okay?
Well, I would say, okay, so at least to me, in terms of pure libertarian theory, or just in terms of what I think is right or wrong, there is such thing as a just war. The most obvious example of that would be you're invaded by a military and fighting them off.
You can see that he struggles to answer that question at the beginning, but he finally gets to, yes, military action can be justified. But by the end of this answer, he's declaring that it's never okay to kill civilians, no matter what.
But I do, so I guess essentially I'd say, no, you don't ever have a right to kill innocent people. It's never self-defense to be killing innocent people. I mean, short of some type of scenario where if you're holding a baby and coming at me shooting and I shoot back at you and, okay, I was acting in self-defense and it happened to kill a baby.
But here's the problem. Those two things, that some military action is justified, but that civilian deaths are never justified, cannot honestly coexist with each other in real-world foreign policy. Of course, it's tragic every time a civilian is killed, and you want to avoid civilian deaths. That's not up for debate. But if your position is that any military action that risks civilian deaths is always unjustified, then your stance is really that military action is never justified. Because whether you like it or not, there is always a risk, especially in urban warfare, which is increasingly the mode of war now. There's always going to be a risk of civilians dying. And this philosophy showed up when Trump bombed Iranian nuclear sites. Even after Dave Smith's predictions of disasters were proven false, he still claims he was right. Why? Because there could have been retaliation. Innocent people could have died. By that logic, innocent people could die. You can never take military action because there's always a threat of something going wrong and people dying that shouldn't. Always. So let's swing this back to Ukraine. Trump has been trying to broker a deal between Russia and Ukraine since taking office. Early on, Zelensky pushed back. We remember the awkward Oval Office meeting. But lately, Zelensky's come around. Trump says jump, Zelensky says how high. Meanwhile, Putin acts friendly with Trump in conversation, says all the right things to him about peace. But then he skips the meeting, launches drone and missile attacks into Kyiv, pushing the front line of the battle, not just at the front lines, but into the major city in the area. Trump finally realized that Putin is just playing him, and the peace talk from Putin is a joke. Trump realized, something that Dave Smith still hasn't, is that the only way to actually save lives in this conflict is to arm Ukraine. If the U.S. does not arm Ukraine, Putin is not stopping. He's made that crystal clear. He talks about wanting peace, but his actions scream the opposite. And quite frankly, why would he stop? He sees total victory within reach, especially if America just sits back on its hands and lets the action play out. Ukraine will not be able to stop Putin without our aid. And Putin, he doesn't care about death toll. It just doesn't cross his mind. He'll keep pushing as long as there isn't meaningful resistance. The only way he reconsiders is when he sees that victory is not going to be as easy as it looks for him right now. And that's the point of arming Ukraine, to end the war faster. Keep Kyiv from being flattened, and it will ultimately save more lives. But hey, in Dave and Tucker's world, if there's a risk civilians could die by American weapons, that's evil. Never mind the avalanche of death that would happen if Russia is just left unchecked and Putin could just walk into Kyiv. And to revisit Dave on Lex Friedman, he has a really hard time condemning Putin. Whenever the war in Ukraine came up, Smith would bend over backwards to talk about what the UN or Ukraine supposedly did before the war happened, as if that's some kind of excuse for Putin.
Do you think all three sides want peace, from what you understand? Obviously, Trump legitimately, fully, with an urgency, wants peace.
I think for sure Trump wants peace. I also think Putin wants to wrap the conflict up. And I think that Putin has been willing to deal for the entire lead up to the war and pretty much throughout the war. And there's been a lot of solid reporting on this. And I mean, the sources on it are pretty impeccable. The head of NATO, Stoltenberg, I always mess up his name, but he literally said that in late 2021, that Vladimir Putin actually sent a draft agreement to NATO, and that his condition for not invading is like, I will not invade, but you have to put it in writing. Like he sent a draft treaty to them. You have to put in writing that Ukraine will not join NATO.
First thing to note about this clip, Putin does not want peace. He says that Putin's been willing to work for peace this entire time. That's just not true. There's no evidence that Putin has been willing to deal throughout this war. Dave's evidence, as he saw, was a 2021 letter that Putin wrote to NATO saying that he would not invade Ukraine if NATO agreed to never accept Ukraine. But even if we take Putin at his word there, that does not mean that Putin has been willing to deal this entire time. His actions with Trump all year have proven that. And later on in the interview, Lex would push back on Dave Smith and say, but you agree Putin is the aggressor, right? And Smith would respond, yeah, but, and then he'd go and repeat the same claims that he made before. And look, he might be right about the pre-war stuff, but the claims that Putin is willing to work for peace right now is just not true. Smith just constantly deflects, is never willing to squarely lay the blame on the guy that's actually launching the missiles. And then he says that Putin's willing to work out a deal. I mean, that's just a total joke. That enough should be evidence that you should not listen to this guy in foreign policy, because that's just not true at all. It just sounds like he's always, suspiciously friendly to America's enemies. And that, quite frankly, brings us to Tucker Carlson. And I'm not going to dwell on Tucker forever, but it's the same type of thing. He'll say it's wrong to kill civilians, and of course, as I said before, you want to avoid civilian deaths as much as possible. But then Tucker will come back and excuse Putin for killing his political opponents and then invading neighboring countries, because all world leaders kill people.
That every leader kills people, including my leader. Every leader kills people. Some kill more than others. Leadership requires killing people. Sorry. That's why I wouldn't want to be a leader.
He'll happily platform people who are fine with mass death. Putin, the president of Iran. But then later he downplays the consequences when it's those people's violence that are doing all the killing. One of the funniest parts of the Superman movie is the national TV commentator that appears just a few times for about 10 seconds each. And this guy is a clear shot at Tucker. It's kind of funny. But and throughout the movie, you see that Lex Luthor is on this guy, this Tucker character, his show. And later, when Lex Luthor is exposed as the bad guy, the Tucker character says something along the lines of, well, turns out Lex Luthor was the bad guy, and we've had him on the show multiple times. And that's funny because in real life, the actual Tucker would never say that. He's had Putin on, and, what does Tucker do? Shrug. He'll defend Putin. He'll defend Russia. Talk about how Russia's such a great place under Putin, And then he brings on the president of Iran, and who loves, death to America. But it's not about death to America, according to the president of Iran. And Tucker just says, okay, whatever. To him, as long as it's not America acting, he doesn't really care about deaths. But as soon as America get involved, America is always wrong. American influence is bad, according to his worldview. And ultimately, what separates Superman from Dave Smith and Tucker Carlson is moral courage. Yeah, Superman's philosophy doesn't track perfectly in the real world, but the guy acts when the stakes are high, and he's a superhero, so he actually can avoid deaths. But Tucker and Dave, they hide behind this "nobody should die" as an excuse to retreat from every tough call. Making foreign policy decisions when innocent lives are at risk is not for the faint of heart. It takes moral courage. And that means weighing all the risks, making the case for why action is necessary, and being willing to carry the blame if things go wrong. That's courage. History gives us frightening examples of what happens when leadership refuses to act out of fear. Rwanda, 1994, the Rwanda genocide. The international community stood by, paralyzed by fear of involvement. Bill Clinton was president at the time, and he still had the Battle of Mogadishu on his mind, which you would know as Black Hawk Down. That was still on his mind from October of 1993 when 18 soldiers died. He feared another 18 soldiers dying, or worse, but because of that, he refused to act and intentionally looked the other way, even intentionally removed peacekeepers from the area. And what was the result? Nearly 1 million people dead in only 100 days, slaughtered in an actual genocide attempt. That is the cost of refusing to act. That is what a lack of moral courage brings to the world. But hey, at least nobody died at America's hands. For Tucker and Dave, their do-nothing policy is rooted in that same fear. It's a refusal to ever take responsibility. If they do nothing, nothing bad is ever their fault. From the sidelines, they can criticize, predict disaster, and claim victory no matter what. If things go badly, they can sit back smugly and say, "Told you so." But if things don't, then they'll say disaster almost happened. We narrowly avoided something terrible. They minimize the good, maximize the risks, and always avoid the real responsibility of leadership. And look, I know they don't have any real power, any real leadership responsibilities, but they're able to sit there with their massive audiences and claim that they were always right and lead millions of people down this path of fear. Because at the end of the day, what they lack is moral courage. The courage to stand up, even to their audiences, and accept the risk of being wrong. And if they ever were in real power, they would be unable to make the hard calls that actually save lives. Because hiding in your shell does not save lives. Having a strong moral compass and acting on it does.